When Barron Trump gave up his first-class seat to an elderly veteran, no one expected the stunning family secret that would unfold mid-flight. What happened next left the entire plane speechless. The cabin lights flickered faintly as passengers settled into their seats, the usual mix of pre-flight anticipation and mild chaos filling the air. It was a brisk morning at Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport, and Flight 247 to Newark was fully booked. Among the crowd of travelers was a young man seated in first class, a face that many recognized immediately, though his demeanor suggested he wished they wouldn't. Barron Trump. Now a teenager standing over 6 feet tall, Barron sat quietly by the window, thumbing through a hardcover book. Unlike others in his family, he rarely appeared in the public eye, but the name attached to his boarding pass meant attention was unavoidable. Across the aisle, an elderly man in his late 70s shuffled into the economy section. His silver hair was neatly combed, his back slightly hunched, and his gait deliberate as he clutched his boarding pass in an aged leather duffel bag. Passengers exchanged glances as the man passed by, his military jacket adorned with faded patches and medals, telling a story of service and sacrifice. Some whispered to each other, wondering about his past, while others simply admired the quiet dignity in his stride. He took his seat near the rear of the plane, wedged between a chatty businessman and a restless toddler. Meanwhile, the flight attendants moved briskly through the aisles, ensuring everyone was seated for takeoff. Just as the cabin door closed, a ripple of tension coursed through the air. The elderly veteran's seatmate had become visibly upset, insisting he needed a different seat. As the veteran apologized for the inconvenience, the commotion drew Barron's attention from his comfortable spot in first class. He leaned slightly into the aisle, his brows furrowing in thought. Then, without a word, he pressed the call button for a flight attendant. "Excuse me," Barron said softly when she arrived. "Can I switch seats with the gentleman in the military jacket?" The flight attendant blinked, momentarily stunned. Passengers in first class glanced up from their newspapers and tablets, their curiosity piqued. The young Trump's offer was unexpected, especially in a world where privilege often went unchallenged. But his expression was earnest, and his tone left no room for negotiation. "Let me check," the attendant replied, her voice carrying a note of surprise as she walked briskly toward the back of the plane. As Barron stood to grab his carry-on bag, the murmurs in first class grew louder. A woman across the aisle leaned toward him. "You don't have to do that, you know. You paid for this seat," she said, her voice tinged with confusion. Barron simply smiled and shrugged. Some people deserve it more. What happened next would change the tone of the entire flight. The flight attendant returned moments later, her expression a mixture of curiosity and admiration. "He said he'd be happy to switch," she informed Barron, her voice carrying a slight tremble. It wasn't every day someone voluntarily gave up a first-class seat, let alone a teenager with a name that turned heads. Barron smiled politely and nodded, grabbing his bag before making his way down the narrow aisle. Passengers whispered as he passed, some nudging each other to confirm what they were witnessing. A few even reached for their phones, subtly snapping photos. Barron walked down the narrow aisle, his head slightly lowered, as if trying not to draw attention. Despite his efforts, a ripple of whispers spread among the passengers. Voluntarily giving up a first-class seat was an uncommon gesture. As he approached the back rows, he spotted the elderly man, wearing a military jacket and carrying the weight of years on his shoulders. "Sir," Barron said in a calm voice, "I'd like to trade seats with you. Please accept. It's something you deserve." The elderly man looked up, his lined face filled with surprise. His eyes scanned the young man, taking him in before responding kindly but firmly. "Son, there's no need for that. You don't have to give up your seat." "I insist," Barron replied. Extending his hand, he added, "Thank you for your service. This is just a small gesture, but it might make your journey more comfortable." For a brief moment, the older man hesitated, his expression shifting as he processed the sincerity in Barron's words. Finally, with a faint smile, he stood up and shook Barron's hand. "Well, if you insist," he said, his voice tinged with gratitude. As the elderly man moved toward first class, his steps deliberate and steady, Barron slid into the now vacant economy seat. The cramped space made it a challenge for his long legs, but he appeared entirely unbothered. Silence hung in the air, as other passengers observed, unable to ignore the quiet generosity of his action. Nearby, a mother cradling her sleeping child murmured to herself, "It's comforting to know there are still people like that out there." Once the plane had taken off, the passengers gradually settled into their routines. Yet the elderly man in first class still seemed affected by what had just happened. Sitting in the comfortable seat, he was offered a drink by a flight attendant, which he accepted with a nod. His gaze drifted toward the back of the plane, seeking the young man who had just made his flight easier. After some time, the woman seated next to him turned and asked quietly, "Do you know who that young man is?" The elderly man shook his head slightly. "I don't," he replied, pausing briefly before adding, "but it's been years since I've met someone like him." As the flight progressed, the atmosphere in the cabin seemed lighter, almost as though Barron's small act of kindness had set an unspoken tone of warmth among the passengers. The elderly man leaned back in the plush first-class seat, his weathered hands resting on the armrests as he gazed out the window. Despite the comfort, his thoughts lingered on the young man who had given up this very seat without hesitation. Back in economy, Barron settled into his cramped row. A flight attendant discreetly approached him. "Can I get you anything, Mr. Trump?" she asked, her voice low enough to avoid drawing attention. Barron shook his head with a polite smile. "I'm fine, thank you," he replied. The woman hesitated for a moment, clearly torn between respecting his privacy and expressing her admiration. Finally, she added, "What you did back there, it was very kind." He nodded appreciatively, then returned to his book, seemingly unbothered by the murmurs of conversation and the occasional curious glances aimed his way. Near the front of the plane, the elderly man had struck up a quiet conversation with the woman seated beside him. She introduced herself as a retired schoolteacher, and their small talk meandered through topics of family, travel, and shared experiences. Eventually, she brought the conversation back to Barron. "Do you know who he is?" she asked. The man's expression softened, a blend of curiosity and respect. "I don't follow the news much these days," he admitted, "but even if I did, it wouldn't change what he just did. It wasn't about who he is. It was about what kind of person he is." Their conversation paused as the flight attendant brought the man a cup of coffee. Taking a sip, he glanced back again, his sharp, discerning eyes finding Barron among the rows of passengers. He noticed how the young man kept to himself, quietly flipping the pages of his book, avoiding the spotlight that his name so often drew. As the plane hit a patch of turbulence, the pilot's voice came over the intercom, steady and reassuring. Passengers instinctively gripped armrests and exchanged nervous looks, but Barron remained calm, his presence almost grounding to those nearby. A little boy seated across the aisle watched him with wide eyes. "Mom," he whispered loudly, tugging on his mother's sleeve. "That's Barron Trump, right?" "The one from TV?" The mother gave her son a subtle nudge, urging him to lower his voice. "Yes, sweetie, but let's not bother him. He's just another passenger right now." Barron caught the exchange and offered the boy a small smile before returning his focus to the book in his hands. As the turbulence subsided and the seatbelt sign blinked off, the elderly man leaned back in his seat, a rare moment of comfort settling over him. He had spent much of his life on cramped military transports, enduring far worse than economy class. Yet this small act of generosity reminded him that kindness could bridge even the widest gaps between generations, wealth, or status. As the plane cruised smoothly above the clouds, the cabin returned to its usual rhythm. Flight attendants made their rounds offering drinks and snacks. Barron remained in his seat, reading quietly, while the elderly man in first class took another glance toward the back of the plane, his mind clearly still processing the events of earlier. Not long after, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached our cruising altitude. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight." The elderly man smiled faintly at the announcement. He looked down at the worn leather duffel bag at his feet, tugging it closer. After a moment of hesitation, he reached inside and pulled out a small, carefully folded photograph. His rough, calloused fingers smoothed the edges as he stared at the faded image. A younger version of himself in uniform, standing beside a woman holding a baby. The faint trace of a tear welled in his eye, but he quickly blinked it away, glancing around to see if anyone had noticed. Back in economy, Barron glanced out the window. The clouds stretched endlessly below, a serene landscape of white. But his thoughts were far from serene. He had grown accustomed to attention, whether wanted or not. The murmurs, the stares, the people who thought they knew him because of the last name on his boarding pass. Yet today felt different. It wasn't about who he was or what people expected of him. It was about doing the right thing, a lesson instilled in him by someone he deeply respected, his mother. His train of thought was interrupted by a soft tap on his shoulder. He turned to see a young flight attendant holding a tray with a drink and a small plate of snacks. "Mr. Trump, compliments of the captain," she said with a warm smile. He hesitated but eventually nodded. "Thank you." As she walked away, he set the tray on the fold-down table in front of him, but didn't touch the food. His mind wandered back to the man now seated in first class. He couldn't stop wondering about the veteran's story. What battles had he fought? What sacrifices had he made? Meanwhile, the woman sitting next to the elderly man broke the silence. "Your medals, they must come with incredible stories," she said, motioning toward his jacket. The man smiled faintly. "Stories, yes, but not all of them are incredible. Some are just reminders." He hesitated before adding, "It's not the medals that matter. It's the people you remember along the way." Her curiosity deepened. "Did you ever think about writing them down? Sharing those stories with the world?" He chuckled lightly, shaking his head. "Who'd want to read about an old man's memories? Besides, the real heroes never came home." His voice carried a weight that silenced her. As the plane approached its descent into Newark, a subtle energy shifted through the cabin. Passengers began tidying up their spaces, preparing for the landing. Barron returned his book to his bag, his gaze momentarily meeting the elderly man's from across the rows. They exchanged a brief nod, an unspoken acknowledgement of mutual respect. When the plane finally touched down, the captain's voice filled the cabin once more. "Welcome to Newark Liberty International Airport. Thank you for flying with us." Passengers stood, collecting their belongings as the usual shuffle toward the exit began. Barron remained seated, letting others pass. As the elderly man reached for his duffel bag in the first-class cabin, a flight attendant stepped in to help. "Thank you, ma'am," he said softly. Before exiting, he turned one last time to look toward the back of the plane, where Barron was standing now, his tall frame towering slightly above the crowd. The older man made his way through the aisle, and as he approached, Barron extended his hand. "Safe travels, sir," Barron said, his voice steady but genuine. The veteran clasped his hand firmly. "You're a good man, young one. Don't ever lose that." With that, the elderly man walked away, his steps lighter than before. Barron watched him go, feeling a strange sense of peace, as though he had done something that mattered, not for recognition, but simply because it was right. As he stepped into the bustling terminal, Barron couldn't help but smile faintly. Somewhere in the sea of travelers, the man in the military jacket disappeared into the crowd, carrying a memory that neither of them would likely forget.